Right now, as you are watching this, the ground under New Zealand's North Island is still settling from a magnitude 5.9 earthquake. It hit at 4:51 in the morning, while most people were asleep in their beds. It shook a stretch of land big enough to be felt from Auckland in the north all the way down to Wellington in the south. And the strange part is, the fault that caused it does not even have an official name yet. Before we get into what actually happened, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the update once scientists finally name the fault behind this. And while you are here, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever felt an earthquake in your own life? I want to know where you were and what it felt like. Now let's get into the story. At 4:51 in the morning on Saturday, July the 25th, 2026, a lot of people in the middle of New Zealand's North Island woke up to their beds shaking. Windows rattled, dogs started barking. Some people said their whole house creaked like a ship at sea. The quake struck near a small town called Tamarindus, in a region called the King Country. At first, most people assumed this was just another deep earthquake, the kind New Zealand gets fairly often, where the shaking starts far underground and arrives at the surface already weakened. That assumption made sense because 8 years earlier, back in 2018, a magnitude 6.2 quake had struck almost the exact same area. That one ruptured 207 kilometers down. That is deeper than 7 Mount Everests stacked end to end. When a quake happens that deep, the energy has to travel so far that it softens out by the time it reaches the surface. But this new quake did not behave like that at all. This one was shallow, only about 9 kilometers deep. To picture that, imagine a hole roughly as deep as 25 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other, but pointing down into the earth instead of up into the sky. 9 kilometers might still sound deep to you, but in earthquake terms, it is practically right under people's feet. And a shallow quake hits the surface with almost all of its original punch still intact. So the first assumption was wrong. This was not a deep, softened tremor like the one from 2018. It was a shallow, sharp jolt, and that is exactly why it woke up sleeping families across a huge stretch of the North Island and even parts of the South Island. Shallow quakes are the ones that rattle windows, crack plaster, and send people running outside in their pajamas. Here's a quick way to understand why depth matters so much. Think about dropping a stone into a pond. If you drop it right at the surface, the splash is big and sudden. If you drop the same stone from underwater, weighed down and released slowly, the ripple on the surface barely shows. A shallow earthquake is like that surface splash. A deep earthquake is like the muffled ripple. Same size stone, completely different experience for anyone standing at the edge of the pond. Now here comes the part that surprised even people who study this stuff for a living. This shallow quake was not caused by two plates grinding past each other, which is what most people picture when they think of an earthquake. Instead, it came from something called normal faulting. That happens when the crust of the earth is being slowly pulled apart, like stretching a piece of taffy until it cracks. The ground on one side of the crack drops down relative to the other side. That is exactly the kind of quake this was. And here is the bigger discovery hiding underneath all of this. The reason the ground here is being stretched apart is because this area sits right at the edge of something called the Taupo volcanic zone. This is one of the most active stretches of rifting crust on the entire planet. It is not famous the way some other fault lines are. Most people have never heard its name. But underneath the surface, it is constantly being pulled in two directions, like a rubber band being stretched a tiny bit more every single year. Let's pause on that comment question from earlier, because I am seeing some of your answers coming in already. Some of you said you felt a quake and thought it was just a truck driving by outside. That is actually really common, and it tells you something important about how our brains process shaking ground. Keep those comments coming. I am reading every one. So to be clear about what is confirmed and what is not. It is confirmed that this was a magnitude 5.9 quake, shallow, caused by normal faulting near the edge of the Taupo volcanic zone. It is confirmed that aftershocks followed, including one measuring 3.7 and another measuring 3.1. What is not yet confirmed is the exact name of the specific fault that ruptured. Geological teams are still studying the data, and if an official name gets published, responsible outlets will update their reporting. Anyone online already telling you the exact fault name with total certainty is getting ahead of the actual science. This matters because a lot of disaster content on the internet likes to skip past that kind of honesty. It is tempting to just slap a scary, definite-sounding name on something and move on. But real geology takes time to confirm, and frankly, the honest answer, We are not completely sure yet, but here is what we do know is a lot more useful to you than a confident guess dressed up as fact. It is worth explaining quickly how scientists even know all of this so fast, because it is not magic, and it is not guesswork either. New Zealand runs a dense network of seismographs, which are simple machines that sit quietly underground and record even the tiniest vibrations in the earth. Think of a seismograph like a very sensitive doctor's stethoscope, except instead of listening to a heartbeat, it is listening to the pulse of the ground itself, 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. When the ground shakes, these machines pick up the vibration and send a signal back almost instantly. Because there are dozens of these stations spread across the country, scientists can compare exactly when the shaking arrived at each one, and use that timing difference to calculate where the quake started and how deep it was, usually within minutes. That is how officials were able to confirm the depth and location of this quake so quickly, long before any human eyewitness report came in. This same network is also what allows scientists to track every aftershock, no matter how small, and build an honest picture of how the ground is behaving over time. It is a slow, patient, unglamorous kind of science, running quietly in the background every single day, and it is exactly the kind of science that made it possible to tell you, within hours, that this quake was shallow, moderate, and not currently linked to a larger imminent event. Now let's talk about the human side of this, because numbers and rock layers only tell half the story. In the town of Tamarindus and the surrounding King Country region, residents describe the shaking as intense but short, lasting somewhere around 10 to 20 seconds. That might not sound long, but if you have ever been in an earthquake, you know that 10 seconds of your house moving under you feels like an eternity.
Roads in the area were affected by landslips, which is when loose soil and rock slide down a hillside after being shaken loose. Some roads had to be temporarily closed while crews checked for damage and cleared debris. The good news, and this is worth repeating clearly, there were no reports of serious injuries or major structural collapse. Emergency crews and local geological teams responded quickly, checking bridges, roads, and public buildings for safety before reopening them to the public. Compare that to a similar magnitude quake in a country with older infrastructure, weaker building codes, or homes built from unreinforced brick and stone. In places like that, a shallow magnitude 5.9 can bring down entire buildings and cause dozens or even hundreds of casualties. New Zealand has some of the strictest earthquake building codes in the world, built and updated after painful lessons from past disasters. That is a huge part of why this event caused disruption and fear, but not tragedy. To understand why those building codes matter so much, look back at New Zealand's own history. In 2011, the city of Christchurch was struck by a shallow magnitude 6.3 earthquake, only slightly stronger than this one. But Christchurch was a dense city full of older, unreinforced brick buildings that had not yet been strengthened. That quake killed 185 people and destroyed much of the city centre. It remains one of the most painful disasters in modern New Zealand history. After Christchurch, the country completely overhauled its building codes, forcing older masonry buildings to be strengthened or torn down, and requiring new construction to flex and sway safely instead of cracking apart. This recent Tamarindus quake happened in a much less densely built, more rural area, with newer construction and far fewer old, unreinforced buildings. That difference in location and building age, far more than luck, is a huge part of why this event caused road closures and landslips instead of collapsed buildings and casualties. Same rough size of shake, very different outcome because of what was standing on top of the ground when it moved. If you are finding this useful so far, consider giving this video a like. It genuinely helps this kind of careful, fact-based reporting reach more people, instead of the exaggerated versions floating around out there. Let's go back to the aftershocks for a moment, because this is where a lot of fear tends to build unnecessarily. After a quake this size, smaller tremors almost always follow. Geologists call these aftershocks, and they happen because the ground around the main rupture is still adjusting, like a stack of books settling after you accidentally bump the shelf. The general rule scientists use is that aftershocks are usually at least 10 times smaller than the main quake, and they get less frequent and less intense as time passes. That pattern is exactly what happened here, with the aftershocks measuring 3.7 and 3.1, both notably smaller than the original 5.9. This brings us to the big scary question a lot of you are probably thinking right now.
Is this connected to something bigger? Is this a warning sign of a much larger earthquake coming? Maybe even a volcanic eruption, since this happened right at the edge of a volcanic zone. Let's answer that honestly, instead of just leaving you with the fear. The Taupo volcanic zone is genuinely one of the most active volcanic and geothermal areas on Earth. It contains geysers, hot springs, and a supervolcano system that has produced massive eruptions in the ancient past. So it is completely fair to wonder if a quake near its edge means something dramatic is brewing underneath. But here is the honest, unglamorous truth. Small to moderate earthquakes happen along the edges of active rift zones like this one fairly regularly. They are a sign that the crust is doing exactly what stretched, cracking crust naturally does over long spans of time. A single magnitude 5.9 normal fault quake, on its own, is not considered by scientists to be a reliable predictor of an imminent volcanic eruption. That does not mean the risk in that region is zero, because no place with active volcanoes and constant rifting ever has zero risk. It means this specific event, on its own, is not the big one everyone always talks about. It is part of an ongoing, mostly gradual process that has been playing out under that part of New Zealand for a very long time, occasionally producing quakes like this one along the way. Scientists who study volcanoes have very specific signs they watch for when they suspect an eruption might actually be approaching. Things like a sudden, sustained swarm of many small quakes clustered right under a volcano, ground that visibly bulges or swells upward, or a sharp spike in volcanic gases escaping from the surface. None of those specific warning signs were reported alongside this event. One shallow, moderate quake at the edge of a large volcanic zone, followed by a normal pattern of shrinking aftershocks, is simply not the same signature as an approaching eruption. That distinction matters, and it is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a headline is built purely for shock value instead of accuracy. Quick reminder before we keep going, if this kind of careful breakdown helps you actually understand disasters instead of just fearing them, subscribing means you will catch every future update the moment new information comes out about this fault. No pressure, just an option if you want it. Now let's zoom out even further, because this is where the story gets genuinely important for anyone living in an earthquake-prone place, not just New Zealand. New Zealand sits directly on what is often called the Ring of Fire, a massive horseshoe-shaped belt stretching around the edges of the Pacific Ocean. Roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes happen somewhere along this belt. Japan, Chile, Indonesia, the west coast of the United States, and New Zealand are all part of this same tense, shifting system of tectonic plates grinding, sliding, and stretching against each other. Within New Zealand specifically, there is one fault that gets far more attention from scientists than the one behind this recent quake, and that is the Alpine Fault, which runs along the South Island. Unlike the normal fault behind this recent Tamarindus quake, the Alpine Fault is a massive strike-slip fault, meaning two enormous chunks of crust are grinding sideways past each other under enormous pressure. Scientists studying that fault have found it tends to rupture roughly every 300 years on average, and it has been over 300 years since its last major rupture. That is a very different, much larger scale risk than what caused this week's quake. So if you were worried this recent quake was somehow connected to that much bigger, much more studied risk, the honest answer is not directly. They are different faults with different mechanisms in different parts of the country. But both are reminders that New Zealand, beautiful as it is, sits on genuinely active ground, and its people have learned to build their lives, their homes, and their emergency systems around that reality. It helps to see how other countries on the same Ring of Fire have adapted to the same basic problem, because the differences are honestly fascinating. Japan, for example, has spent decades building an earthquake early warning system that can detect the fast, less damaging waves a quake sends out first, and use those few precious seconds to send alerts to phones and trains before the slower, more damaging shaking arrives. It is not magic, it is just physics. The first waves simply travel faster than the second, more destructive ones, and that tiny head start can be enough to stop a train or get a child under a desk. Chile, another country sitting on the same fiery ring, has some of the strictest building codes on the planet after suffering repeated massive earthquakes across its history, including one of the largest ever recorded back in 1960. Indonesia, by contrast, still struggles in many regions with inconsistent building standards and limited early warning coverage, which is a major reason why earthquakes of similar size can produce wildly different death tolls depending on which country they strike. The quake itself does not decide who lives and who dies. Preparation, construction, and warning systems decide that. New Zealand sits somewhere near the more prepared end of that spectrum, thanks to lessons paid for in past tragedies like Christchurch. But preparation is never finished. It is an ongoing project, constantly updated as scientists learn more about how the ground beneath cities and towns actually behaves. If you want to keep learning how different countries handle the exact same natural forces in such different ways, this channel covers that kind of comparison often, so subscribing means you will not miss the next one. If you have family or friends who live somewhere earthquake-prone, or who are just curious travelers thinking about visiting New Zealand, this might be a good moment to share this with them. Understanding the difference between a moderate quake like this one and a truly massive fault rupture could genuinely change how someone prepares. Let's talk now about what you personally can actually do with this information, because fear without action does not help anyone, and I want this to be useful, not just unsettling. If you live in an earthquake-prone area, anywhere in the world, there are a few simple, concrete steps that make a real difference. First, know the drop, cover, and hold on method. The instant you feel shaking, drop to your hands and knees, cover your head and neck, ideally under a sturdy table, and hold on until the shaking stops. This single habit prevents a huge share of earthquake injuries, which mostly come from falling objects, not collapsing buildings. Second, secure heavy furniture like bookshelves and water heaters to the wall using simple, inexpensive straps or brackets. A huge number of earthquake injuries come from furniture tipping over, not from the building itself failing. Third, keep a small emergency kit somewhere easy to grab, with water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and any medication you or your family need. It does not need to be complicated or expensive. It just needs to exist and be somewhere you can actually reach it in the dark. Fourth, if you live somewhere near a coastline in an earthquake-prone region, learn your local tsunami evacuation routes ahead of time, even if this particular quake did not trigger a tsunami warning. Shallow-depth earthquakes near coastlines sometimes can, and knowing your route in advance means you are not trying to figure it out while the ground is still shaking. And fifth, if you have elderly neighbors or people with mobility challenges nearby, it genuinely helps to have a simple, agreed-upon plan for checking on each other after a big shake. Communities that look out for each other consistently see better outcomes after disasters than communities where everyone is on their own. There are a few more small habits worth building too, because preparation is really just a collection of small, boring decisions made ahead of time. If you drive, try to keep your fuel tank at least half full, since fuel stations can lose power or run out quickly right after a disaster. At work or school, take a minute to actually notice where the nearest sturdy desk or interior wall is, instead of assuming you would figure it out in the moment. In the panic of real shaking, people tend to freeze or default to whatever they already know, so building the habit now genuinely matters later. If you have young kids, it is worth practicing drop, cover, and hold on with them the same way you might practice a fire drill, turning it into a quick, low-stress game rather than a scary lecture. Kids who have practiced a response ahead of time tend to react calmly and quickly, instead of freezing, because their bodies already know what to do before their brain even has to think about it. None of this requires spending money on fancy equipment. It mostly just requires 10 or 15 minutes of your time, spent once, and then occasionally refreshed. One more comment-style question for you while we are here. If you had to grab one thing from your home in an emergency, besides people and pets, what would it be? I am genuinely curious what people value, so drop it below. I read through all of these. Let's return to the science for a moment, because there is one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding clearly. Why does New Zealand's North Island have both deep subduction earthquakes, like the one back in 2018, and shallow rifting earthquakes, like the one that just happened, in almost the exact same region? The answer lies in the layered structure underneath that part of the country. Beneath the North Island, one tectonic plate, the Pacific Plate, is slowly sliding underneath another, the Australian Plate, in a process called subduction. Picture two conveyor belts, one slowly sliding beneath the other at an angle, disappearing down into the deep earth over millions of years. That sliding process is what caused the much deeper 2018 quake, 207 kilometers down, inside that descending slab. But at the same time, closer to the surface, the crust above that sliding plate is being stretched apart by the volcanic and geothermal forces of the Taupo volcanic zone. So you end up with two completely different quake-generating systems stacked almost on top of each other, like two different machines running in the same building, one deep underground, one much closer to the surface. That is exactly why the 2018 quake and this most recent one, despite happening in nearly the same location, came from such different depths and different causes. You can actually see evidence of this stretching all over the surface of the Taupo volcanic zone if you know what to look for. The area is dotted with geysers, bubbling mud pools, and steaming hot springs, all powered by the same underground heat that comes from this constant pulling apart of the crust. Tourists visit these sites every year without necessarily realizing that the same forces creating that steam and bubbling mud are also the forces that occasionally produce quakes like the one that just happened. It is the same underlying engine, just showing up in two very different ways on the surface, one gentle and photogenic, the other sudden and unsettling. Scientists sometimes describe the Taupo volcanic zone as one of the fastest stretching pieces of crust on the planet, widening by a small number of millimeters every single year. That might sound tiny, almost meaningless, but stretch anything by even a few millimeters a year, consistently, for thousands of years, and eventually something has to give. Most of the time, that release happens quietly, in tiny movements nobody feels. Every so often, it happens all at once, in a jolt like the one that hit Tamarindus. This layered complexity is part of why New Zealand invests so heavily in scientific monitoring. The country runs one of the most detailed earthquake monitoring networks in the world, constantly tracking tiny tremors most people never even feel, building a long-term picture of how the ground beneath them is behaving, year after year. That kind of patient, ongoing science is exactly how events like this recent quake get understood properly instead of just feared. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, that the same country famous for its calm green hills and quiet sheep farms is also sitting on top of two separate overlapping earthquake systems, one sliding deep below, one stretching much closer to the surface. Most residents go their whole lives barely thinking about it, the same way most of us do not think about the slow, constant churn of weather systems above our heads. It only becomes vivid and immediate on mornings like this one, when the quiet, ordinary ground beneath a sleeping town suddenly reminds everyone that it was never actually still to begin with. If this kind of layered, honest explanation is helping things click for you, that is exactly why I make these breakdowns. Consider subscribing so the next time an event like this happens anywhere in the world, you already have the background to actually understand it, instead of just reacting to headlines. Let's talk about what typically happens in the days and weeks that follow a quake like this one. Geological teams usually continue monitoring aftershocks for weeks, sometimes months, watching to see whether the pattern follows the expected gradual decline or whether anything unusual shows up. Engineers inspect bridges, older buildings, and any structures that showed visible damage, making sure nothing is at risk of delayed collapse. Local governments typically review emergency response times, checking whether communication systems, road clearing crews, and public alerts worked as intended. For most people living in the region, life mostly returns to normal within days, aside from repairing any cracked walls or fixing fallen items around the house. Insurance assessors typically visit affected homes to document any damage, and local councils often set up simple online forms so residents can report cracked chimneys, shifted foundations, or slumped driveways without having to wait in line at an office. None of this is dramatic. It is mostly paperwork, patience, and small repairs, which is honestly what recovery from a moderate quake usually looks like, far less cinematic than disaster movies make it seem. But there is a quieter, longer-term value here too. Every quake like this one adds another data point to scientists' growing understanding of how this particular stretch of active, stretching crust behaves. Over decades, these data points build into models that help predict, in a general statistical sense, how often quakes of different sizes are likely to occur in this region going forward. Engineers use those same models when deciding how strong a new hospital, school, or bridge needs to be built in that specific area, long before construction ever begins. That is genuinely one of the most underappreciated parts of earthquake science. It is not about predicting the exact day and location of the next quake, because that level of precision simply is not possible with current science, and honestly, may never be. It is about slowly building a clearer, more accurate picture of risk over time, which then shapes everything from building codes to emergency planning to where new hospitals and schools get built. If a friend or family member ever brushes off earthquake safety by saying it will probably never happen to them, this might be a good video to send their way. Sometimes seeing the actual mechanics behind an event does more to change someone's mind than just being told to be careful. So here is where all of this leaves us. A magnitude 5.9 earthquake struck a part of New Zealand many people had never heard of at 4:51 in the morning, waking up families across a huge stretch of the North Island. It came from a stretching, cracking piece of crust at the edge of one of the most volcanically active zones on the planet, not from the more famous fault most people assume causes every New Zealand quake. It did real, visible damage in the form of landslips and road closures, but thanks to strict building codes and a strong emergency response, it did not turn into a tragedy. And it is not, on its own, a sign that something much bigger is imminent, even though it happened near an active volcanic zone that absolutely deserves long-term respect and attention. The real lesson here is not that the ground is constantly about to fail beneath our feet. It is that patient, honest science and consistent, unglamorous preparation are what actually protect people when the ground does eventually move. Fear alone never kept a single family safe. Understanding and a simple plan are what do. Every earthquake story like this one is really two stories happening at once. There is the story of the ground itself, ancient, slow, and mostly indifferent to us, doing what stretched and cracking crust has done for millions of years. And there is the story of the people living on top of it, learning, building, and preparing a little better with each generation. The ground will keep doing what it does, whether we understand it or not. The only part of this story we actually get to control is how ready we choose to be when it happens again. Thank you for sticking with me through this whole breakdown. If new information comes out about this quake, or if that fault finally gets an official name, I will be back with an update, so consider subscribing if you want to be there for it. Take care of yourselves, check in on your neighbors, and I will see you in the next one.